want to start by telling you a story about a boy named Jack. Jack grew up in California in the United States in a school district called Los Altos. Los Altos is a very nice school district. It's a middle to upper class school district. But Jack, when he started the 5th grade in 2010, had a bit of a problem in math. He started that year 3rd to bottom of his class in math. 3rd to bottom. And the teacher would sit there doing lesson plans and delivering lessons that were pitched for the middle of his 30-person class. And Jack would just get more and more frustrated and fell further and further behind. And at some point, he just considered himself one of those kids who would just never, quote, get it. For the educators in the room, you sort of know what that feels like for those students. When they say, I just can't get it. The question is now, what would happen to Jack if he continued along this path? He would have gotten grouped into the bottom of his math class. That would have meant he would not have done algebra until high school. That would have limited his college and career choices ultimately and hurt him for the rest of his life. The question is, why does our education system work this way? The reason is because our education system was literally built to model the factories of over 100 years ago. It's a factory model of education. The theory was that if we take a bunch of students, all who are the same age, and we batch them up like we do with raw material in a factory, and we put them into what we call classrooms, and that we teach them the same thing in the same way on the same day, that because they're the same age, they'll magically learn at the same rate, and then we can ship them out the other side to the next grade, and things will be just fine. The theory was that we'll sort kids out. So the slower kids, quote unquote, like Jack, it's okay that they don't learn everything because we can shift them out into factory jobs and so forth. And to be fair, this worked for a very, very long time. It was a great way to educate massive numbers of students. And it was okay that they didn't fulfill their fullest human potential because the factory economy of that era did not need everyone to fulfill their potential. The problem, though, is this. The world has fundamentally changed. We now live in a globalized world and a knowledge economy where we expect every child, and we need every child, to fulfill their fullest human potential. And the problem with that factory model of education is it was never built to optimize every child's learning. What we know, and educators certainly know this, parents with more than one child certainly know this, is that everyone has different learning needs at different times. Academics have argued about this for tens and tens of years now. Which differences are the ones that matter? Are they really differences? But what we all know is that, and what we all agree on, is that students learn at different paces. Some people grab onto material quickly and just swallow it up. Other people have to struggle with something. They have to figure it out. It takes them a little bit longer. And no one's the same. It depends upon subject. I'm fast in one thing, someone else is fast in another thing where I have to struggle. The question is, why do we have these differences? And simply put, it's because all of us have what cognitive scientists refer to as different working memory capacities. Literally different aptitudes to absorb information in the front of our brains and manipulate it actively. And we all enter learning experiences with different levels of background knowledge. Literally, we all have different experiences, memories, things that we come into education with, which, interestingly enough, means that if I use a phrase in the course of my talk this morning that one of you doesn't understand, even if it's only ancillary to what I'm trying to say, the natural reaction of the human brain is to grab onto that phrase and obsess over it as the lesson continues to go by and you miss the point of it. Because we have these differences, we learn different paces and we have different learning needs at different times. And the challenge with the factory model education system is that it was built to be a one-size-fits-all system, to treat every student the same way, which means that we cannot allow every child to fulfill his or her human potential in that system. We need to change it. Now, the exciting thing about the era in which we live is that for the first time, we see a disruptive innovation that's coming on the scene in education. The first disruptive innovation, I would argue, since the printing press, most likely in education, has come on in this era and gives us an opportunity to rethink what education looks like. Let me step back for one moment just to make sure we're all on the same page. Because when I use the word disruptive innovation or I say disrupting class, if you're like a lot of teachers, that doesn't thrill you. That sounds a little scary. But I mean something very specific by the word disruptive innovation. What I mean by it is this force that has transformed countless sectors from things that were complicated, expensive, deeply centralized, and inaccessible, so that it could only serve a limited few, into something that's far more affordable, convenient, accessible, and simple, so that it can serve many, many, many more people. I'll give you just a couple examples. In the computing world, if we'd gone back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, computers were dominated by mainframe computers and mini computers, large machines that could cost up to a couple $1 million to own, and were really complicated to use, only experts could use them. And therefore, the majority of us just went on in life without access to computing. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, this thing came on the scene called the personal computer, or the desktop computer. And it was so simple and affordable, it cost only a couple $1,000s, and now the computing came to you at your desktop, that it allowed millions and millions and millions of more people around the world to have access to computing. Show of hands, how many people remember those early personal computers? Well, I appreciate it. This is an honest audience. Thank you. So those early machines were primitive, right? They could barely do word processing, let alone the things we use them for now. And so all the folks in the mainframe and mini computer world, they looked out at this personal computer and they said, that's not all that interesting. We don't need to do anything with that. But they didn't count on a few things. The first is that technology improves much faster than our lives change. So what at one point was not good enough for those expert users got better and better and better, such that by the late 1980s it was good enough for the majority of people, and people rushed out to use the personal computer, delighted with something that was so simple that someone as simple as me could use it. The second thing people don't count on when a disruptive innovation comes on the scene is that it starts in areas of what we call non-consumption. It starts by serving people whose alternative is literally nothing at all. It gets its start there, and that's when it starts to improve. So the first personal computer, this little company called Apple, that no one had heard of, they sold the first computer as a toy to children and hobbyists. Children were delighted with this machine because they couldn't afford a $2 million computer, it turned out. And so it was better than their alternative, nothing. Started there and got better and better and changed the world. Now, how many of you have smartphones in your pockets today? Almost everyone. So the really cool thing about a smartphone is this. It's a disruptive innovation relative to the personal computer. And now in all of your palms of your hands, you have more computing power than existed on this entire face of the earth combined some 50 years ago. And the really cool thing about this is this. If you get bored of me at any point in time, you can take out that computer in your hand and become productive again. So we've seen disruptive innovation change the world. A little closer to home in Brazil, Embraer Jet is a classic disruptive innovation relative to Boeing and Airbus. While Boeing tries to build the next biggest airline jet ever created, the 787, bit by bit, Embraer takes the regional jets and is just grabbing on and getting better and better and changing the way flight occurs around the world. So what does this have to do with education? Well, as I said, the first disruptive innovation in education since the printing press, arguably, has come on the scene in the last 20 years or so in the form of online learning. And it presents an opportunity to transform our education system away from this factory model one into a student-centered one. So like all disruptive innovations, online learning started as not very good. It started in the late 1980s as this primitive thing that wasn't all that interesting. And it started by serving non-consumers. So in higher education, it started by serving adults who were working and had jobs and kids and just couldn't go back to college for a full academic experience. But as you'll hear later today from the CEO of the Minerva Project, online learning in higher education has gotten better and better and better and is introducing innovations that people don't think are all that crummy anymore. In K-12, it's been a little bit trickier to figure out how this would work itself out. Because in many parts of the world, schooling is there. There's no non-consumption. And so certainly in places like India where they don't have schools, we can put a school in a hole in the wall and disrupt schooling. But for the most part, the story in K-12 education has been one of disrupting the way class is done, the way classrooms work. And we've been taking online learning at that level. And so the first instances of online learning making an impact in K through 12 education was in high school, in the classes that high schools wish they could offer, but they weren't able to. I'll just give one example. In America, in 2007, 26% of high school students attended a high school that offered 0 advanced classes. 0. And what I mean by that is anything above biology, so no chemistry, no physics, defined as anything above geometry, so no algebra 2, forget about calculus, and defined as any honors English class, period. 26% of high school students in America. Think about it. They wanted those opportunities to learn, and they just couldn't have access to them. But online learning is planting itself in these areas and growing so fast that it led us in 2008 in our book, Disrupting Class, to make a prediction that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses in America would be delivered online in some form or fashion. Now, that's a bold prediction, but I don't want you to focus on the prediction. What I want you to ask yourself is, as educators, can we take this disruptive innovation and actually create a student-centered education design that we would want every child to have? Will online learning realize that transformational potential? And there I think it's an open question. I think there's a lot of positive signs, and I think there's a lot of question marks. For the next few minutes, I want to focus on a couple of the positives. The first positive is that because online learning is inherently modular, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, students can get a personalized learning experience for their different needs almost naturally. What that means is that I can progress at a path and pace that makes sense for me, and you'll be hearing from Zach later today of Codecademy. He can move much, much faster than I can because he's a lot smarter than I am, and therefore we can move at our different paces, and it's okay if I have to review an earlier concept or learn physics through a basketball analogy, because we can start to individualize and personalize online learning in this way. That's all well and good. It creates some huge opportunities. The question is, will we realize these opportunities to personalize learning in the ways different people need? So there's some positive signs, which is that online learning is improving, as all technologies do when they get their start in disruptive ways. I want to focus on 4 improvements that we're seeing with online learning. The first is that broadband and internet infrastructure is getting better and better and better all around the world. So more people are getting more access to this technology, and we're being able to do some very interesting things with it. The second and related thing is that 10 years ago, it was extraordinarily hard to communicate through online learning. But I'm curious, how many people now use Skype or Google Hangout? The majority of you. You know that we can communicate with anyone, anywhere by video around the entire world almost for free. And with touchscreens and 3D technology coming on, who knows where this will be in 10 or 15 years. The third way is that the content itself is starting to get more and more engaging and motivating and interesting. If you went back to online learning some 20 years ago, it was basically a boring correspondence course put online. But increasingly we're starting to see game-based learning, simulations, and all sorts of things that make people excited about learning being woven into the fabric of the opportunities to learn. And the fourth thing is that while online learning started as a distance learning phenomenon, increasingly we're seeing that online learning is blending itself into brick and mortar schools to create what we call a blended learning experience. And our hypothesis is that in K-12 education, for many different reasons, the vast majority of students will learn in schools with teachers in blended learning environments. When I use the term blended learning, what I mean is that students are learning, at least in part through online learning, where they have some element of control over the time, the place, the path, or the pace of learning, the things that allows it to personalize for them, and that it happens in brick and mortar schools with teachers. It's that simple. And we're seeing lots of different variations of it. This is a classroom in Los Angeles, California. It serves over 90% low-income students. And they use blended learning to set up what we call a station rotation. You can see that they use it to divide the class of 30 students into 3 groups. And a group of 10 students can work there on the rug with the teacher. And then we have 10 students on the back there on computers. And 10 students are creating projects and getting to be creative with the material that they've learned to actually create things of value. This school in Los Angeles, California, is one of the top schools in the entire state and in the entire country with what we would think of as a very challenged population, because blended learning is not a panacea, but it allowed them to do small group instruction to really reach each of these students. Here's another example from Summit Public Schools that I believe spoke at Transformar last year. This is a flex environment where students move flexibly and fluidly through different activities as needs be so that they can get their learning done. And what Summit has realized is that it turns out that you only need about an hour or 2 a day of personalized learning time on the computer where the student can drive their learning through the different objectives that they need to master, and that they can spend the rest of the time in really robust Socratic discussions and doing projects, applying what they're learning online to actually more meaningful applications in everyday life. So they need the ability to get the knowledge, that's really important, but then they can apply it in really interesting ways. And students, we've never given them enough credit to be able to accelerate in this way is what they're finding. One more picture, which is what are the teachers doing in these environments? The answer is we're seeing them do a lot of things. In one school, Carpe Diem, they're individually working with students and tutoring them. In other schools, they're facilitating projects or discussions. In other schools, they're playing the role of mentor or learning coach, or that person that helps keep you on track for all the non-academic reasons that you might fall off, to really make sure that you're succeeding. Teachers are a critical part of this, but the great thing about blended learning that we're seeing, and that you'll hear about, is that it frees them up from having to do lesson planning for an entire class or trying to reach all 30 students through one lesson. And now they can reach every single child, as it really humanizes the classroom experience between teachers and students. So we've seen these examples now of blended learning in practice. And the question is, will we realize this potential? I want to go back to the story about Jack in Los Altos, California. Jack is fortunate that he grew up in this era where online learning is coming and can change the way the world learns. And what's exciting is that the classroom that he went to, the school that he went to, partnered with the Khan Academy to create at that time a station rotation so that every child could learn in the way that made sense for him or her. And what Jack realized was this. He actually was just struggling with a few very rudimentary basic concepts that occurred well before 5th grade, and it was holding him back. And with Khan Academy, he could go all the way back into his learning and start to focus in on those one or two concepts that were tripping him up and spend some time working on them. And once he mastered them, he started flying through the curriculum, literally flying through the curriculum. Turned out that Jack wasn't a slow learner or a learner that needed to be at the bottom. Just in that given day, he was a little bit behind. But he was able to catch up, and after day 70, just 70 days in that 5th grade classroom, he was 4th from the top in his math class. He went from 3rd to the bottom to 4th to the top. So I just want to ask us this. In the old system, in the factory model system, we would have assumed a lot of things about Jack and limited his college and career options. But with blended learning, what we saw was that we could personalize for him so that he could accelerate. And it wasn't just Jack. In that 5th grade classroom, students there ended up doing trigonometry by the end of the year. Folks, we've been practicing education malpractice all along. And it's not the fault of anyone in this room, but it's because we have a design that does not make sense for learning. But we have a once-in-a-generation chance to redesign that experience. And if we're to be successful and create the different experiences that we think students should have, it's going to take all of us in this room, educators especially, policymakers, to create the room so that we can seize hold of blended learning in these K through 12 schools to create that student-centered design so that every student, like Jack, can get it and find their passion and fulfill their potential. Thank you very much.